Hello quilters, I have all my pieces cut for the quilt top for my pinwheel popper quilt for the quilt along. And you can see here pinwheel pieces, blades, all those fabrics were from Clover, and got some pretty fabric from Ethereal for the background. And I used a little bit different technique to cut these, kind of a time saver technique. I will say that this technique works much better if you are cutting all same size pieces in even numbers from your strips, and it works perfectly for this pattern. And I did record it so you can see if you like it, and just know that this is the way I cut these pieces. It's a technique I like to use, but it doesn't mean you have to do it that way. If you know a better way, you can go ahead and do that. So I'll show you how I did this. Hey quilters, Sarah here, and today we are going to cut our fabrics for the pinwheel popper quilt. So right here you see all of my fabrics for the top of my quilt, and this pattern is designed so that all your fabrics are going to come in half-yard cuts, and you're only going to use 2 different cutting instructions to cut all of them. So let's just have a quick look at the fabric. I do have another video where I talked about how to pick fabric and went over all the exact fabrics, so I will link to that playlist, and this will go in that playlist too, but I'll link to that playlist, and when I make new videos for the quilt along, all those videos will be added to that playlist so you can see them all in one place. But real quick, this fabrics I've got here are all from Meander and Make. That is Melanie from Southern Charm Quilts Fabric Shop, and these are actually all designed by her as well. So these fabrics, like this orange one and over to the right, are all from Clover. So let's take a little close-up of those so you can see those nice, pretty, subtle designs, and they all have it. So that is going to be so pretty. And then these 4 here, these prints are all from her fabric line Ethereal, and that is a line of really pretty low volume fabrics, and these coordinate so well. I'm super excited to use them. So we've got these 3 here are going to be my pinwheels, and then all the other 8 cuts are interchangeable as far as this. Both of these, both the white ones and these pink and tangerines, can either be the blades or the background. So you'll want to go ahead and press your fabrics, and then I will meet you at the cutting station and show you how I go about cutting these. Hey quilters, Sarah here from Snugglebug Stitching, and so I'm going to show you how to do the 2 different cutting instructions that you'll run into in the pinwheel popper pattern. So what I've got here today, I've got some half-yard cuts so I can demo. I've got my 18 by 24 inch cutting mat, a rotary cutter, and here I have a 12.5 inch square ruler and a 16.5 inch square ruler. And you can actually do all of this with a 12.5 inch square ruler. The 16.5 is going to work a little bit better for one of the cutting instructions, but if you don't have one, you can definitely make it work with the 12.5 inch. And I'm going to show the instructions with that one first, because I figure that's probably the one that most people have. And as you can see, we are set up at my kitchen table today. If you've watched very many of my videos on YouTube or Instagram, you probably usually see me cutting at a big cutting mat, and that particular cutting mat fits perfectly with a table that was made specifically for me for my cutting station. It was designed and built by Mr. Snugglebug Stitching with my cutting space, my sewing workspace area, and my technique and my kind of workflow and style in mind. So it's really customized, and a lot of people don't have space for that or don't have somebody to build that for them, and that is perfectly okay. You don't need all that stuff to be able to be part of quilting. So today I'm going to show this on my kitchen table so that it may look a little bit more like what some of you might be doing. And the big cutting mat is great, I love it, but for this demo I decided to do a setup that you know, maybe a little bit more common for people. So make sure that you have a new blade on your rotary cutter or a blade that's still nice and sharp. We will end up folding our fabrics in half and cutting 4 layers at a time, and your rotary cutter should cut through 4 layers of regular quilting cotton like butter. And if it's not, time to get a new blade. And I do have a video on that, which I will link in the description. So we're gonna start with the cutting instructions for color 1. So I've got my fabric here, and the first thing you're gonna do is you're going to fold this in half, selvage to selvage. And I like to fold it, and it's not gonna be, you don't have to fold it, you won't be able to fold it exactly in half selvage to selvage, but pretty close. And you just want this crease here to be smooth and not wrinkled up. So I like to fold it so that the big selvage, the thick selvage is on top. That way I can kind of see it, keep an eye on it, make sure I'm not cutting into that and getting, you know, end up getting blocks that I can't use. So for these color 1 cutting instructions, it's going to tell you to cut 3 4.5 inch by width of fabric strips. So we're going to use our 12.5 inch square ruler first, and with that one you can only cut 2 of them at a time, but we're going to do that. And since I folded this in half once and then again folded it into 4ths, you're going to divide the number of pieces you get after the subcut by 4. So the instructions for this one will say to cut 3 4.5 inch by width of fabric strips, and then subcut 8 squares from each strip. So 8 divided by 4 is 2. So what we're doing, we're basically cutting 2 at a time. And this ruler, this 12.5 inch square ruler, will actually allow us to cut 2 strips at a time. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to start by cutting a 9 inch square. So you want to make sure that the 9 inch line on your ruler vertically and the 9 inch line on your ruler horizontally is within your fabric. So keep an eye on these edges to make sure all of that's in there. And I'm going to bring this 9 inch line down here to where it's about 1/4 inch from the bottom. This does not have to be folded perfectly. The only reason you would have to worry about it being folded perfectly would be if you had like some really directional prints that you were worried that they wouldn't look good if it wasn't folded perfectly. But this print here, this clover print from Meander & Make, it doesn't have to be folded perfectly, and it's still gonna look great. So we're going to hold firm pressure with our ruler, and we're going to use our rotary cutter. We're going to move this to the side for now. So we cut the side, now we're going to cut the top. All right, now we're going to leave this fabric in place, and I'm just going to move the mat, rotate it around, and that allows us to keep our fabric stacked perfectly from when we just cut it, and we're not having to worry about trying to realign this fabric with lines on the mat. And also, it's a great way to work that 18 by 24 inch cutting mat to your advantage. So now we're going to line the 9 inch line vertically and the 9 inch line horizontally up with these 2 square edges that we just made. And make those cuts. All right, and now that we have that cut, we're going to cut this stack that we have here into 4.5 inch squares. So I'm lining my 4.5 inch line here up with this side that I just this side, this nice square side that we cut. Hold firm pressure with your hand. All right, and now that is cut into 4.5 inch strips. We're going to rotate this mat, and I'm going to cut another 4.5 inch section here. So I'm going to line the 4.5 inch line on my ruler up with the square side here, and make that cut in the opposite direction. All right, so now, since we divided that, we folded that over into fourths, I've got 2 of my 4.5 inch strips ready and subcut. So I'm going to grab this little part that was left over that we kind of set to the side for a second, and I've got this oriented the same way to where I have the thick selvage on top, and the reason I do that is just so that I can keep an eye on that and make sure I'm not going to end up cutting into it. And this technically should be a nice straight line because we just cut it, but just in case I mess that up in the process of moving it around, I'm going to give myself a little bit of room. So we only have one more 4.5 inch strip to cut here. So I'm going to take that 4.5 inch line and bring it in maybe a 1/4 inch or so into the fabric, so I make sure that I give myself some room. And I've got my 9 inch line here down close to the bottom, but you want to give yourself around a 1/4 inch or an 1/8 inch, just so that you end up cutting this part where it's folded over, getting those 2 pieces separated completely. So we're going to make that cut and then cut the top. And now we're going to rotate our mat, leaving our fabric in place. And I'm going to line the 4.5 inch vertical line up with this nice square cut that we just made, and the 9 inch horizontal line up with the bottom. And you see how that came apart nicely? It wasn't sticking, and that's because the rotary cutter blade is nice and sharp. And if you find yourself having to push really hard to get it to cut through, go ahead and change the blade and save yourself some frustration. Okay, so now that we have this strip cut, we're going to cut that into this little stack into 2 4.5 inch squares. So I'm going to rotate this mat again, line my 4.5 inch vertical line up with this side right here. And there you go. That is all of your cuts and subcuts for that 1/2 yard. So I said I would show you how to do this with your 16.5 inch square ruler. So I'm going to show you that right now. And that's going to allow you, if you have a 16.5 inch ruler, it will allow you to cut all 3 strips at once. So same thing, grab your 1/2 yard cut. You're going to fold it in half, selvage to selvage, and just kind of like to make sure that it's smooth here, it's not wrinkled at the bottom. And then do that again. So we got it folded into fourths. And we're using the same cutting instructions with this one, but I'm going to show you how to cut 3 of them at a time instead of just 2 of them. So we're gonna do all 3 at a time here. So we'll grab our 16.5 inch square ruler. And since we're using 4.5 inch squares, we're gonna multiply that by 3 to get our quilt math and get our marking on our ruler that we need. So 4.5 times 3 is 13.5. So you're going to get the 13.5 inch vertical line, and make sure that it is within the fabric, and just, you know, be sure you can get it kind of close to the edge, but just be sure that it's within all the fabric. So on this edge here, just be sure that that 13.5 inch line is a little bit over from the shortest one. And then we're going to move our 9.5 inch horizontal line down close to this bottom fold, and I'm going to go about 1/4 inch. And we're doing the same thing pretty much, except for we're going to cut all 3 at a time instead of 2. So we're going to make this cut to the side and make our cut to the top. All right. So now that we have those 2 squared lines, we're going to leave our fabric where it is, so we don't have to worry about disturbing that nice neat stack that we just cut into, and we don't have to worry about trying to realign our fabric. So we're just going to flip that 18 by 24 inch cutting mat, and now I'm going to line my 13.5 inch vertical line up with this side, and my 9 inch horizontal line up with this square side that we just cut. And once we have that, we're going to remove this excess around the ruler like we did in the other one. So now that we've done that, we can cut this into 3 4.5 inch strips. So we're basically going to go backwards. So 13.5 is our first 4.5 inch increment, and the next one is 9. So we're going to line this 9 inch vertical line up with this squared edge here. And I'm going to make that cut. And then we'll pull it back by 1 more 4.5 inch increment. So we'll end up lining up our 4.5 inch vertical line up with this straight edge, this squared off edge here. So lining that 4.5 inch line up with that edge. All right, so that's got us 3 4.5 inch strips. And now all we need to do is cut this in half so that we have all of our 4.5 inch squares. So we're going to rotate that mat again. And I'm going to get my 4.5 inch vertical line and line it up with this side right here, with these sides of those strips. Okay, so when you make that cut, you have all of your 4.5 inch squares that you need from that half yard cut. And you can use the 12.5 inch method that I showed you, or you can use the 16.5 inch ruler method, whichever one you have, whichever method you like better. And if you have another method that you like better for cutting your fabric, go for that. You know, this is just what I do, and I'm just showing you in case it might help you too. So the next diagram is going to be where we cut. It's not a cut, sorry. The next cutting technique, the next cutting instructions are going to be where we cut the pieces for the blades and the background. The squares are the pinwheels, and the other set of cutting instructions is blades and background. For this one, it does not matter whether you use a 16.5 inch ruler or a 12.5 inch square ruler. You can also get away with a 9.5 inch square ruler for this one. So we're going to do the same thing. We're going to start doing the same thing. Fold that fabric in half, selvage to selvage, and then just kind of make sure that it's smooth at the bottom, with this little fold at the bottom, and then do that again. And we're going to start by cutting 8.5 inch by width of fabric strips. I'm just going to go ahead and rotate this mat around long ways just because it's an easier camera view for you. So we're going to start by cutting an 8.5 inch by width of fabric strips. And this one is going to be subcut into 8 pieces, just like the squares were. So we are going to fold this one over 4 layers thick, like we've got it right now, and cut 2 pieces at a time, so 8 pieces at a time, just like we did with the squares. So got our 12.5-inch square ruler, whatever size ruler you have. You can get away with a 9.5-inch square ruler with this one too. And the first thing we're gonna do is get that cut into that 8.5-inch with the fabric strip. So I'm going to cut that first, and I've got my 8.5-inch vertical line here. Just make sure that it is within the edges of all of these fabrics. And we're going to subcut these into 8.5-inch by 4.5-inch rectangles. So our line that we're using at the bottom for the horizontal line is going to be the 9-inch line. So I'm going to move that 9-inch line down so that it is really close to the bottom. And what that is going to do is just leave you with a little bit more of a usable scrap up here. You can also bring it all the way up and cut all the way through that side if you want to. But if you take that line, that bottom line, close to the bottom of the fabric, then it's just going to give you leave you with a little bit more usable scrap at the top. So you'll give yourself around 1/8 to 1/4 inch at the bottom here. And let's make that first cut. I'm going to move this to the side, and we'll use it in a second. And cut that part at the top. So I'm going to move this ruler out of the way, and we are going to rotate our mat just like we did before. And now we have our nice edges that we just squared off are here and here. So you're going to take the 8.5-inch vertical line and the 9-inch horizontal line and line those up with these parts right here. So I've got the 8-inch vertical line lined up here and the 9-inch horizontal line lined up here. All right, so 8.5-inch line, 9-inch line. And we are going to cut here to trim off that excess around the side and the top. Okay, so now that you've got that done, we are going to cut this into we're going to cut the stack into 2 4.5-inch by 8.5-inch rectangles. And since we've got this doubled over 4 times, that's going to make all 8 of our subcuts that we need. So something to kind of be careful about when you are cutting these 8.5-inch by 4.5-inch rectangles is to be sure that you cut it along the right line. So if I come here and cut this 4.5-inch line here, then I've got a good 4.5-inch by 8-inch rectangle here, but this other side is not big enough because the 4.5-inch line that you cut needs to go along the 9-inch part. So what I would recommend that you do here is keep this 8.5-inch vertical line lined up with this edge. That way you know that you are keeping the 8.5-inch width for those rectangles. And then we're going to move the 4.5-inch horizontal line down to line up with the bottom edge of this fabric. And now that that's lined up at the bottom, we can move it over a little bit But if you keep that 8.5 inch by 4.5 inch lined up, then that's a good test for knowing that you're cutting it in the right direction. Because if we cut it in this direction, we'd have a 4.5 inch by 9 inch rectangle, and then like a 3.5 inch by 9 inch rectangle. So 8.5 inch line lined up here, 4.5 inch line lined up here. And then if you want to move it over a little bit, now that you've got that lined up, you can. And instead of rotating the mat, just because that could make us confused, I'm just going to leave it like here, right here like this, and just cut along the top. All right, and that's got us our first 8 4.5 inch by 8.5 inch rectangles. And we are going to grab this other piece that we set to the side and do the same thing with it. So the first thing you're going to do, grab that 12.5 inch square ruler, and you're going to do the same thing. You're going to have the 8.5 inch line within this fabric here, and make sure that it is within all the pieces. So if you were to just kind of check through and make sure you don't have the fold wonky and one of them going in too far. And this technically should be a straight edge from where we just cut it, but since I did move it around, I'm going to give myself just a little bit of wiggle room, maybe 1/8 inch to 1/4 inch. And then you want the 9 inch line, the 9 inch horizontal line within the fabric here. And I usually like to give myself around an 1/8 inch to 1/4 inch at the bottom, just because within this part at the bottom it's folded. You can't see the part on the inside, so you just want to give yourself a little bit of leeway there. So I got about 1/4 inch leeway here, and around an 1/8 to 1/4 inch on this side. So now we're going to cut to the side and to the top. And we're going to flip this mat, rotate it around. We're not moving the fabric. That just keeps it lined up nice for us. And you're going to line up your 8.5 inch vertical line here and your 9 inch horizontal line with this straight edge here. And we'll have a little bit to sides that we need to trim off to the sides and the top. All right, so now we need to cut this 8.5 inch by 9 inch stack into two 8.5 inch by 4.5 inch rectangles, just like we did with the first one. And we're going to do the same thing. I'm going to line that up, 8.5 inch line, 9 inch line, and you want to be sure that you're cutting 8.5 inch by 4.5 inch pieces. So if I keep this still where it is, keep that 8.5 inch line lined up here, and I know that this is the 8.5 inch width because I've got it lined up like that, and I'm just going to move this down so that my 4.5 inch horizontal line lines up with the bottom edge of that fabric. So that's just a good test to make sure that you are cutting the second line in the right direction. So 8.5 inches here, 4.5 inches here. So we're going to keep this still and just make that cut to the top. So now we have our 8.5 inch by 4.5 inch rectangles. And we got all of that cut pretty quick. And you will use the instructions that we use for the squares for color 1. So 3/2 yard cuts that when you cut that way, and the instructions that I just gave you for color 2 and 3. So I hope you like this technique, and if you have another technique you like better, go ahead and use that. Hope you're enjoying the quilt along.